I should have let you die. Those were the first words my father spoke to me after I saved another soldier's life. Not well done, not are you okay? Just that. He stood over me, the 4 stars on his collar glinting in the Nevada sun, his face a mask of utter disgust. I was on my knees on the scorching tarmac, hands cuffed behind my back, and the man who gave me life was sentencing me to a living death. He leaned down, his voice a low, guttural whisper so only I could hear the venom. You contaminate everything you touch, Florence. You have since the day you were born. Letting you die in the Gulf would have been a mercy. At least then, you would have been a hero, not this disgrace. He thought he was burying me under the weight of his hatred, but he was wrong. He wasn't burying Floss Trent, the mechanic he'd created to hide his shame. He was unearthing Phoenix, and Phoenix always rises from the ashes, fiercer than before. If you know what this pain feels like, hit the like button. And in the comments, tell me what city you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone in this fight. My name is Floss Trent. I'm 36 years old. And to understand why my father wished me dead for an act of heroism, you have to go back 90 minutes. Back to when I was just a mechanic with grease on her hands and a young pilot was falling from the sky. 90 minutes earlier, my world was simple. It smelled of hydraulic fluid and hot asphalt. My biggest problem was a stubborn actuator on an F-15's landing gear. The sun beat down on the hangar, and the vast empty sky over Nellis Air Force Base was a peaceful, indifferent blue. Then the siren shrieked. It's a sound that cuts through everything, a high, piercing wail that signals the breaking of that peace. The quick reaction alert. Every airman on the flight line froze. My head snapped up toward the main display, and my heart dropped. A single icon, tagged Skyhammer 2-1, was plummeting. The air traffic controller's voice, strained with a panic he couldn't contain, crackled over the base-wide comms. Mayday, Mayday, Skyhammer 2-1 is in a flat spin. Pilot has ejected. I repeat, pilot has ejected. A collective breath was held across the base. Ejection was violent, but survivable. Then came the second transmission, the one that turned a crisis into a death sentence. Negative deployment on the main chute. Reserve is not deploying. God damn it, his reserve is tangled. The data feed flashed on the screen. Lieutenant Cody Rivas, 26 years old. Falling from 12,000 feet. My mind, a machine I'd tried to power down for 5 years, roared back to life. It wasn't thought, it was instinct. A blizzard of calculations. Wind speed, 15 knots. Rate of descent, 120 miles per hour. A life reduced to a number, 90 seconds. Our entire squadron was miles away on a training exercise. There was only one aircraft on the QRA pad, armed and ready, the F-23 Black Widow II, a top-secret prototype. Its designated pilot was in a comfortable, air-conditioned room in Washington, D.C. A court-martial was the best I could hope for. A prison sentence was more likely. But the image of a young man's body vaporizing against the desert floor was a price I refused to pay. My body was already moving. I sprinted from the hangar, my boots pounding on the shimmering tarmac. 2 security forces guards, kids barely out of their teens, moved to block my path to the secure hangar. Sergeant Trent, this is a restricted area. You are not authorized, one of them yelled, his hand moving uncertainly toward his sidearm. I didn't break stride. There was no time for words. 5 years of fixing jets hadn't erased a lifetime of training. A swift parry of the guard's outstretched arm, a pivot, a controlled takedown that sent him stumbling into his partner. They were off balance, confused, but unharmed. It bought me the 4 seconds I needed. I was up the boarding ladder, my palm slapping the canopy's emergency release. With a hiss of hydraulics, the cockpit opened, and a ghost embraced me. The scent of worn leather and cold electronics filled my lungs. My grease-stained hands moved with a forgotten grace, gliding over the control panel, flicking switches in a sequence burned into my very soul. A calm, synthesized voice filled the cockpit. Authorization required. Please state call sign. I took one deep, steadying breath. The person who spoke next wasn't Floss Trent. It was someone I had killed and buried 5 years ago. My voice was a clear, cold command. Call sign, Phoenix. Activate. There was a half-second of digital silence. Then, the system replied, "Welcome back, Phoenix." The thunderous, earth-shaking roar of the F-23's experimental engines was a sound of resurrection. I ignored the pre-flight checklist, pushed the throttle to the firewall, and the Black Widow launched forward like an avenging angel. The G-force was a brutal, beautiful reunion, pinning me to my seat as I tore a hole in the empty sky. Below me, Rivas was a tumbling speck, a life about to be extinguished. My plan was pure madness. I was going to use sound as a weapon. I pushed the jet past Mach 1, then Mach 1.5, the desert floor a meaningless blur. The goal was a high-speed, low-altitude dive, pulling up at the last possible second. The resulting sonic boom, a focused pressure wave of air, would, if I timed it perfectly, violently slap his reserve chute open. Too close, it would kill him. Too far, it would do nothing. The altimeter unwound. 15,000 feet, 10,000, 5,000. It was a waltz on the edge of a razor blade. I aimed not at him, but at a pocket of air 50 yards to his left. Now. I yanked back on the stick, the F-23 screaming in protest as it leveled out just feet above the scrub brush. Inside the cockpit, there was only the sound of my own breathing. Outside, I had just ripped the sky in two. The sonic boom erupted, a double thunderclap of invisible force. On my rear monitor, I watched the shockwave hit the falling figure. For a terrifying second, nothing. Then, a sudden glorious bloom of white silk. His chute was open. He was alive. Relief, pure and overwhelming, flooded through me. For the first time in 5 years, I felt whole. But as my wheels kissed the runway, the relief turned to ice in my veins. The celebration I expected wasn't there. Instead, a semicircle of olive-drab Humvees from the security forces waited, their lights flashing silently. And standing before them, my father, his face a mask of granite, waited too. The story had come full circle. I was back on the tarmac, back on my knees, back under the cold, unforgiving gaze of the man who had just wished me dead. The words of my father's curse still echoed in the silence of the holding cell. They weren't just words. They were ghosts, joining the others that had haunted me for 5 years. I sat on the cold metal bench, the cinder block walls pressing in, and I felt a familiar, hollow ache spread through my chest. Despair. My gaze fell to my left wrist, to the small faded tattoo just below the cuff of my jumpsuit. It was a simple design. The letters TG and the numbers 0717. Top Gun. July 2017. A lifetime ago. It was meant to be a mark of my greatest triumph. Now, it was just the trigger for the memories of how it all fell apart. I closed my eyes and the sterile hum of the cell faded away, replaced by the low clink of silverware on fine china. I was back at a high-end steakhouse in Reno, the kind with thick leather booths and waiters in crisp black aprons. The air smelled of seared meat and expensive wine. It was the night of my Top Gun graduation. I had not only been the sole woman in my class, I had graduated at the top, shattering records that had stood for a decade. The trophy, a sleek silver eagle, sat on the white linen tablecloth between my father and me. We sat in a silence as thick and heavy as the porterhouse steak on his plate. I was buzzing with a nervous energy, a desperate, almost childlike hope that this unprecedented achievement would finally be enough. I waited for a word, a nod, a simple, "I'm proud of you." He finished his steak, meticulously cutting the last piece. He placed his knife and fork together on the plate, perfectly parallel. He picked up his linen napkin, dabbed at the corners of his mouth, and then he finally looked at me. His eyes were flat, analytical. "General MacArthur's son graduated today as well," he said, his voice calm and even. "He has a bright future, knows how to build relationships, play the game. You." He paused, folding the napkin and placing it on the table. "You just know how to fly. In this world, Florence, just flying is never enough. Don't get any illusions." He never called me Floss. That was a name my friends, my fellow pilots, had given me. To him, I was only ever Florence. His words didn't feel like a splash of cold water. They felt like a slow-acting poison, turning my victory into a worthless pile of ash right before my eyes. The tattoo on my wrist didn't just remind me of that night. It pulled me further back, to the moment it all truly ended. 5 years ago, the Persian Gulf. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was a shimmering, hazy blue. I was flying patrol with him, a swaggering hotshot, the son of a powerful U.S. senator. He was reckless, flying on ego instead of training. To show off, he pushed his F-18 too close to Iranian airspace, a stupid, arrogant maneuver. The sky lit up with the electronic scream of their air defense systems locking onto us. We pulled back, avoiding an international incident by a razor's edge, but the damage was done. In the debriefing room, the air was thick with political tension. It wasn't about the mission anymore. It was about protecting a senator's son. The hotshot, sweating under the fluorescent lights, told the lie they had coached him to tell. A navigational equipment malfunction on my aircraft. My jet. My father, General Vance, was presiding over the meeting. He sat at the head of the long, polished table. I watched him. I watched as he looked directly at me, his own daughter, his eyes holding mine for a single, excruciating second. Then, I saw his gaze shift, moving past me to the corner of the room where the senator sat, his arms crossed, his face grim. In that silent, almost imperceptible movement, I saw the choice being made. He wasn't choosing a lie over the truth. He was choosing his career, his political alliances, over his own child. In that moment, he didn't have a daughter. He just had an acceptable loss. The final memory was the coldest. I was standing in his office at the Pentagon a week later. The room was immaculate, filled with flags, awards, and photos of him with powerful men. None of them were of me. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer a choice. He issued a command. The official record will state that Captain Phoenix Vance is missing, presumed killed in a training accident, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. A hero's death. As for you, Florence, you will be given a new identity, a mechanic's rating. You'll be transferred to Nellis. It's either that or a court-martial for treason that will destroy the Vance family name because of your recklessness. Be grateful I'm giving you a chance to continue breathing. It wasn't protection. It was an exorcism. He was casting out the part of his life that didn't fit his perfect narrative. A few weeks later, I sat in a cheap apartment and watched the evening news. I saw my own face flash on the screen as the anchor read my eulogy, celebrating the heroic life and tragic death of Captain Phoenix Vance. He had held a memorial service for me, a funeral for a person who was still alive. I opened my eyes. The cold of the holding cell rushed back in, chasing the ghosts away. The despair was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to finally extinguish whatever spark I had left. For 5 years, he had been the master of my fate. He had written my story, my death, and my miserable new life. But then, another ghost entered the room. A gentler one. My mother. She had died years before, taken by a sudden aneurysm, but her voice was as clear as if she were sitting next to me. She was reciting the lines from her favorite poem, the one by William Ernest Henley she'd read to me whenever I felt lost. My lips moved, forming the words in a whisper that was barely a breath. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. I repeated it, the words feeling foreign but true. He had taken my wings, my name, my life. He had been the master of my fate for 5 long years. But my soul, that fire he thought he'd smothered, it was still mine. A tiny ember began to glow in the darkness. He would not put it out. Not again. This time, I would be the captain. The ember of defiance I'd found in that holding cell was a fragile thing. I knew it would be tested. I just didn't know how quickly, or how brutally. I was released on bail, but released was the wrong word. I was suspended from duty and confined to base, a prisoner in a larger cell. The whispers started immediately. I had become a spectacle, a creature in a zoo of my own making. Walking into the mess hall was the hardest part. The moment I stepped through the doors, the loud, boisterous chatter of hundreds of airmen would die, not instantly, but in a rolling wave of silence that followed me across the room. All that was left was the scrape of forks on plates and the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on my back. I'd sit at an empty table and try to eat, my food tasting like cardboard, while the whispers lapped at the edges of my hearing, deliberately loud enough for me to catch the fragments. That's her, the crazy mechanic. Heard she slept her way out of a court-martial. The words of strangers were easy enough to ignore. What truly hurt were the eyes of my own crew. The other mechanics, the enlisted men and women I'd worked alongside, sharing cold beers and greasy rags under the relentless Nevada sun. They were my people, my tribe. Now, they looked at me with a mixture of fear and betrayal, as if I had broken some sacred, unwritten rule. I had stepped out of line, and in their world, you don't step out of line. I was a pariah. After a few days of this suffocating silence, I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I climbed into my old pickup truck, the engine rumbling a familiar comfort, and drove off base. I ended up at the Checkered Flag, a dusty neon-lit bar just outside the main gate where pilots went to brag and mechanics went to forget. I just wanted a cold beer in a dark corner, a moment of anonymity. But there's no anonymity when you're the lead story on the base rumor mill. A group of young F-16 pilots at the bar recognized me. Their leader, a cocky lieutenant with the call sign Slider, swaggered over, his buddies trailing behind him like hyenas. He slammed his whiskey glass down on my small table. Well, Sergeant Trent, he sneered, drawing out my rank with contempt. I heard you got the cockpit of that new Black Widow a little dirty. Need us flyboys to teach you how to clean it up? Oh, wait, he smirked. That's your job, isn't it? The group behind him erupted in laughter. The air in the bar grew thick and still. This was a performance, and I was the unwilling star. For a moment, the old rage, the phoenix, wanted to surface. But I held it down. I looked up from my beer, my eyes meeting his. I kept my voice low and cold, as sharp as ice. That cockpit is cleaner than your character, Lieutenant. I stood up slowly, pulling a $20 bill from my pocket and laying it on the table to cover my untouched beer. I walked toward the exit without another word, leaving him and his cronies standing in a stunned, awkward silence. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a fight, but the victory felt hollow. The next day, I understood why. The invisible pressure I'd been feeling became a solid wall. My father had made his calls. An official wall of silence was erected around the incident. Rivas's mission debrief was classified top secret. My requests for information were denied. My own service record was flagged. Friends who'd texted me a few days ago suddenly stopped replying. People I'd known for years would see me coming down a hallway and abruptly turn the other way. I was completely, utterly isolated, stripped of my allies, cut off from the truth. That night, I sat alone in my small, sterile apartment, the kind they give to senior NCOs. I stared out the window at the vast, empty desert stretching into the darkness, and I felt a loneliness so profound it ached in my bones. I was more alone than Rivas had been as he fell from the sky. I was an island in a hostile sea, and the tide was rising. The ember of defiance was sputtering, close to being extinguished by the suffocating darkness. Just as I felt myself start to sink, to truly give up, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, confident. I opened it to find Colonel Jax Calloway. He stepped inside quickly and shut the door behind him, his presence filling the small room. His face was grim. "They're trying to erase you, Trent," he said, his voice low. "Your father is leaning on everyone, from the wing commander down to the squadron chiefs." He walked to the small table in my living area and placed a tiny black USB drive on its surface. It looked impossibly small to hold any hope. "This is the cockpit voice recording from Rivas's F-16. I made a copy before they sealed the evidence," he explained. "Listen to the last 30 seconds, and there's something else." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to me. The card was crisp, official. "Major Evelyn Reed, JAG Corps," he said. "She's a shark. I called in a favor. Her plane lands in an hour." He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time in days, someone saw past the disgraced sergeant, past the broken mechanic. He saw the person I used to be, the person I still was, buried deep inside. "Don't give up," he said, his voice firm with an authority that had nothing to do with rank. Phoenix. He called me Phoenix. And that one word, that one crack in the wall of silence, was enough to fan the dying ember back into a flame. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've learned to live without it. After Colonel Calloway left, I held the small USB drive and the crisp business card in my hand, half expecting them to disappear. For 5 years, I had fought alone. Trust was a foreign country I hadn't visited in a long time. But the way he said my name, Phoenix, had unlocked something inside me. I had to take the chance. An hour later, I met Major Evelyn Reed in a temporary office they'd assigned her. She was nothing like the stuffy, by-the-book JAG lawyers I'd imagined. She was sharp, dressed in a perfectly tailored service uniform, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the mechanic's jumpsuit and into the pilot I used to be. She didn't offer condolences or empty platitudes. She got straight to the point. General Vance is a legend in the Pentagon, she began, her voice a finely tuned instrument of precision and confidence. But every legend has cracks in its foundation. Our job, she said, leaning forward slightly, is to find those cracks and drive a sledgehammer through them. There were no false promises of an easy victory. She spent the next 2 hours interrogating me, not as a prosecutor, but as a weapons specialist studying her arsenal. She fired off questions about Top Gun, about the Persian Gulf, about my father. They were tough, relentless questions that forced me to revisit memories I had locked away. But for the first time, I wasn't a defendant trying to protect herself. I was a warrior, being armed for battle. Let's see what our friend the Colonel gave us, Reed said finally, taking the USB drive and plugging it into her laptop. She put on a pair of headphones, listened for a moment, then handed a second pair to me. The recording from Rivas's black box was mostly static and the sound of his own ragged, panicked breathing as he fell. My stomach clenched listening to it. But then, just before the recording ended, just before he would have lost consciousness, his voice came through, weak and garbled, but unmistakable. Oxygen system. Failure. Not pilot error. Report. Maintenance neglect. Reed and I looked at each other. My breath caught in my throat. It was right there. The crash wasn't Rivas's fault. It was an equipment failure, a known issue with the F-16's oxygen system that had been reported before but ignored to cut costs. This was bigger than my unauthorized flight. My father wasn't just trying to bury my act of heroism, he was covering up a deadly pattern of negligence at one of the Air Force's most important bases. This was the crack in the foundation. And we had just found it. The next day, I received a message. Lieutenant Rivas was awake, and he was asking for me. Walking into that hospital room felt surreal. He was pale and hooked up to monitors, but his eyes were clear. He struggled to sit up as I entered. "They told me you were a mechanic," he said, his voice hoarse. He shook his head slightly. "But I saw you fly. I saw you dance on the edge of a sonic boom to save me. That wasn't a mechanic. That was a guardian angel." He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a raw, unfiltered gratitude that I had never seen in my life. "I owe you my life, Sergeant. Whatever you need, anything, I'll do it." That was the moment the dam inside me finally broke. All my life, I had chased my father's approval, craving a single word of recognition for my accomplishments. But this heartfelt acknowledgement from a young man I'd saved, a man who saw me not as a disgrace, but as a hero, was worth more than every medal my father had ever pinned to his chest. That evening, Colonel Calloway invited us to his home off base for dinner. When I arrived, Major Reed was already there, along with Rivas, looking much better in his civilian clothes. The house was warm and filled with the smell of something rich and spicy. Calloway's wife, a kind woman with a warm Louisiana smile, was stirring a large pot on the stove. "Chicken and andouille sausage gumbo," she announced cheerfully, "guaranteed to heal whatever ails you." We sat around their heavy oak dining table, a world away from the cold formality of military life. We didn't talk about the case. Instead, we talked about our lives, our dreams, the places we wanted to see. Rivas talked about wanting to teach his future son how to fly. Reed talked about hiking the Appalachian Trail. Calloway told stories about his early days as a pilot. For the first time in 5 years, I felt my shoulders relax. I felt like I belonged. This wasn't the suffocating, silent dinner at a fancy steakhouse with a powerful father judging my worth. This was laughter, warmth, and the easy comfort of people who had your back. This was a real family. A family forged not by blood, but by a shared, unspoken oath. The promise that you never, ever leave a fallen comrade behind. As the evening wound down, we gathered in the living room, the atmosphere shifting from social to strategic. Reed laid out our first steps, her voice sharp and focused once more. We had the recording. We had a witness. We had a starting point. We had a team. Looking at the faces around me, a sharp lawyer, a grateful pilot, a brave colonel, I felt that fragile ember of defiance roar into a steady, determined flame. My father had built a wall of silence around me, but tonight, with this new family, we were drawing up the plans for the battering ram. For the first time in 5 years, I had a team. I had a plan. I had hope. And my father, with the instinct of a predator, knew that was the moment to strike. He couldn't stop the investigation publicly, so he moved in the shadows, aiming not for my case, but for my soul. It started with a phone call. An unknown number. I answered, and a voice I hadn't heard in years filled my ear. Not the cold, commanding voice of the general, but the warm, deep voice of my father, the one he used when I was a little girl, and he was trying to coax me out from a hiding place. "Florence," he said, the name itself a carefully chosen weapon. "I know you're angry, but this has all gone too far. Drop it. Just let it go. I can arrange a quiet life for you, somewhere far away from all this. Don't do this to the family. Don't tarnish your mother's legacy." My mother. He knew she was my only vulnerability, the one pure memory he hadn't yet managed to corrupt. He was dangling the idea of peace in front of me, wrapping it in a poisoned blanket of false, fatherly concern. And for a sickening second, the little girl inside me wanted to believe him. The exhaustion of the fight washed over me, and the offer of a quiet life was dangerously tempting. But then I saw their faces in my mind. Reed's sharp, intelligent eyes. Calloway's steady resolve. Rivas's raw gratitude. My voice trembled, but it did not break. "My mother's legacy is truth, General," I said, putting a wall of rank between us. "And I will not betray her." I hung up before he could reply, my hand shaking. The second attack came from a direction I never anticipated. The presiding officer for my Article 32 hearing was announced, Colonel Mason Hawk Croft. My heart soared. Hawk had been my lead instructor at Top Gun, a mentor I revered like a second father. He was a man of impeccable integrity. With him in charge, the truth would prevail. I met him in his temporary office the day before the hearing. I expected a firm handshake, a reassuring word. Instead, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He fiddled with a pen on his desk, his movements heavy with a discomfort that made my stomach tighten. "My son, David," he began, his voice low and strained. "He's a captain now, up for a promotion to a command position, under your father." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a pain that mirrored my own. "Floss," he said, the name an apology. He never said a word, but I got the message. It's my son's career. Or your truth. I'm sorry. The air left my lungs. It was a physical blow, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. My father hadn't just threatened a man I respected. He had turned him into the instrument of my destruction. He had taken my hope and twisted it into another betrayal. The hearing began the next morning in a sterile wood-paneled courtroom on base. It was a preliminary procedure meant to determine if there was enough evidence for a full court-martial. My father sat at the prosecution's table, not as a witness, but as a concerned senior officer, a pillar of the Air Force. He looked calm, detached, like a spectator at a play he had already written. After the initial charges were read, his lawyer, a shark from the Pentagon, presented his first piece of evidence. It was my psychological evaluation from 5 years ago, the one my father had forced me to take after the Persian Gulf incident. But it wasn't the report I remembered. It had been subtly, brilliantly altered. Words were twisted, phrases recontextualized. The report now painted a picture of a pilot with a pattern of reckless impulsivity, an unstable psychological profile, and a pathological disregard for authority. They argued that my heroic flight to save Rivas wasn't heroism at all. It was a symptom, a relapse of a dangerous mental condition. They were turning me from a hero into a ticking time bomb, a menace in a flight suit. I looked at my father. He met my gaze for a moment, his expression utterly blank, before turning his attention back to the proceedings. But the final blow, the one that was meant to shatter me completely, was yet to come. His lawyer turned his attention back to me. "Sergeant Trent," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Is it correct that your mother, the late Eleanor Vance, passed away from a ruptured brain aneurysm?" The question hung in the silent courtroom. Reed shot to her feet to object, but I barely heard her. I knew where this was going. "And is it also correct," the lawyer continued, ignoring her, "that such conditions can be hereditary and have been linked to impaired judgment under extreme stress?" The world tilted. A wave of nausea washed over me. He was using my mother's tragic death, the woman he had supposedly loved, the woman whose memory he had pretended to protect on the phone just days ago. He was using her death as a weapon to suggest that I was genetically, irreparably insane. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a public execution of my character, my career, and my sanity. I stared across the courtroom at my father. The mask of the concerned general was gone. His face was placid, his hands calmly folded on the table. He was watching his strategy unfold perfectly. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I didn't see a father. I didn't see a general. I saw a monster. I don't remember leaving the courtroom. The world had dissolved into a roaring in my ears, the faces of my father and my mentor blurring into a nightmarish collage of betrayal. The next thing I knew, I was in my pickup truck, driving. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I left the lights of Nellis Air Force Base to be swallowed by the dark. I drove deeper into the vast, silent emptiness of the Mojave Desert, chasing nothing. I finally stopped when the road gave way to dirt. I killed the engine. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight that was louder than any sound, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. Above me, the night sky was a brilliant, merciless canopy of stars. It was all gone. Everything had finally collapsed. My father had used my love for my mother to declare me insane. The man I trusted had sold his integrity to save his son's career. The system I'd sworn to serve was actively participating in my destruction. A sound started deep in my throat, a low groan of agony. It built until I slammed my forehead against the steering wheel and screamed. It was a raw, wordless howl of rage and grief, a sound torn from the deepest part of my soul. It was the sound of 5 years of enforced silence, 5 years of swallowing pain, finally ripping its way out of me and into the unforgiving desert. When the scream died, leaving only my ragged breathing in the cab, all that remained was a chilling emptiness. The thought of disappearing became a siren song. To just keep driving until I ran out of road, ran out of gas, ran out of self. Silence had been my prison. Now, it felt like my only escape. But in the profound stillness that followed, another thought surfaced. A memory from a military history class. Tailhook. The scandal from '91. The stories of brilliant female aviators who were harassed, assaulted, and then systematically destroyed when they dared to speak up. The system had closed ranks, labeled them troublemakers, and buried their careers to protect its own. And I realized, sitting there in the darkness, that my story wasn't my own. It was a new verse in a very old song. My father, with his medals and obsession with legacy, was the living embodiment of that rotten system. A system that demanded silence and sacrificed its daughters to protect its powerful sons. My silence wouldn't be an escape, it would be a surrender. It would be a betrayal of every woman who had fought and been crushed before me. My silence would let him win. And in this world, silence is a form of death. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and angry. They weren't tears of despair. They were tears of pure rage. I cried for Florence, the little girl who spent her life chasing a phantom of fatherly approval. I cried for Phoenix, the pilot who was murdered on paper to protect a political alliance. I cried for Floss, the mechanic who lived in the shadows, an apology for still being alive. I mourned them all, one last time, letting the tears wash them away. When the final tear fell, something inside me shifted. The raging fire of my anger burned away the last of my fear, cauterizing the wound. A cold, hard calm settled over me, as clear and sharp as the desert air. I had nothing left to lose. My father had taken everything from me. In doing so, he had made a fatal mistake. He had made me invincible. I turned the key. The truck's engine roared to life, a mirror of the storm now perfectly controlled inside me. I spun the truck around, tires spitting gravel, and headed back toward the base, my headlights cutting a determined path through the night. My eyes, reflecting the dim light of the dashboard, were burning. It was 2 a.m. when I walked into Evelyn Reed's temporary office. The light was on. She was sitting at her desk, surrounded by legal books, as if she had been expecting me. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I was wondering if you were going to break," she said, her voice even. I walked to her desk and planted my hands on its surface, leaning forward so she could see the new fire in my eyes. "No," I said, my voice low and steady, without a trace of the woman who had been screaming in the desert. "I'm not going to break, and I'm done defending myself. From this moment on, we attack." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise and respect. "I want everything back," I continued, each word a steel plate being riveted into place. "I want Phoenix's flight record restored. I want the truth of what happened in the Persian Gulf exposed. And I want my father to answer for what he has done, not just to a military court, but to the court of conscience and history." I stood up straight, my resolve as solid as the ground beneath my feet. If you believe that a person's spirit is the one thing no one has the right to take from them, hit that like button right now. And in the comments, I just want you to type one word: rise. Let's send a message. I looked at the stunned but determined expression on my lawyer's face. "So get ready, Major," I said, a cold fire in my voice. "Because General Vance is about to meet the storm he created." The storm I had promised my father was not going to be one of blind rage. It would be a calculated, precise, and overwhelming assault. The fire inside me had cooled into a cold, hard focus. I was no longer a victim. I was Phoenix, and I was planning a mission. Major Evelyn Reed's temporary office was transformed. It ceased to be a room and became a war room. She had taped a large official portrait of General Sterling Vance to the center of a whiteboard. He stared out at us, stern and decorated, the perfect image of a military legend. "To defeat a man like Sterling Vance, you have to understand what he fears losing most," Reed said, her voice sharp as she circled the portrait with a red marker. "And it's not his career or his freedom, it's his legacy. His obsession is his own perfect, unblemished image in the history books." We spent the next few days in a relentless deep dive, mapping the mind of our enemy. Reed pulled every public record, every report my father had ever signed off on. With my insider knowledge, I pointed out the anomalies, the underfunded maintenance budgets for standard aircraft like the F-16s, contrasted with the lavish, expedited funding for his pet projects. We were drawing a psychological profile, looking for the pressure points where his obsession with image had led him to cut corners and make enemies. While we built our strategy, Cody Echo Rivas was fighting his own battle on the ground. He was still on medical leave, but he refused to stay on the sidelines. My father's office had already sent quiet but firm warnings to him to keep his mouth shut. But the kid had steel in him. He knew he owed me his life, and he was determined to pay that debt. He started making quiet calls, meeting with other maintenance technicians in his squadron. He sought out the ones who, like him, had flagged the recurring failures in the F-16's oxygen system. At first, they were terrified. No enlisted man wants to cross a 4-star general. But my story and Rivas's fierce loyalty to me gave them courage. One night, Rivas met a young airman, barely 20 years old, at a Greasy Spoon diner miles outside of Vegas. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, The kid slid a thick manila envelope across the sticky table. Inside were photocopies of every ignored maintenance report and every unanswered email warning about the faulty oxygen systems for the last 18 months. It was a ticking time bomb, documented in black and white. We now had proof of systemic negligence, but the biggest challenge remained: the incident in the Persian Gulf 5 years ago. It was the original sin, the lie that had started everything. Reed used her contacts at the Pentagon, but every door was slammed shut. The records were sealed under national security protocols or had been conveniently lost in a server migration. The official story was a concrete wall. We were hitting that wall again and again when a stray memory surfaced in my mind. A detail so small I'd almost forgotten it. The air traffic controller on duty during that fateful patrol. Master Sergeant Davies. A good man, honest to a fault, who I remembered had looked deeply uncomfortable during the initial debrief. I found him through the Military Retirees Network. He was living a quiet life in San Diego, spending his days fishing on a small boat. When I called him, the warmth in his voice vanished the moment I said my name. The fear was still there, 5 years later. "I can't help you," he said, his voice tight. They made it very clear what would happen if I ever spoke about that day again. I didn't push. I didn't threaten. I just let the silence sit there for a moment. "They took the sky away from me, Master Sergeant," I said quietly. "Please don't let them take the truth too." I thanked him for his time and hung up, feeling the familiar sting of another closed door. The days ticked by, bringing us closer and closer to the formal hearing. We had a strong case regarding the negligence at Nellis, but the ghost of the Persian Gulf still hung over me, the lie that painted me as an unstable pilot. Reed was preparing our defense, but we both knew that without something to crack that original story, we were fighting an uphill battle. Then, 2 days before the hearing, the unexpected happened. The door to our war room opened and a man walked in. He looked older than I remembered, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond his years. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of a long-held guilt. It was him, the hotshot pilot, the senator's son who had sacrificed my career to save his own. Reed and I just stared, speechless. He stood there, shifting his weight, unable to meet my eyes. "My father passed away last month," he said, his voice quiet and rough. "The cancer finally got him. He can't protect me anymore." He took a deep breath. "And General Vance. He dropped me the second I was no longer useful to him. I've been living with that lie for 5 years. It's eating me alive." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital voice recorder. He placed it on the table between us. It was the silver bullet we never thought we would find. "This is a recording of the conversation I had with General Vance in his office, the day after the incident," he said, finally looking at me, his eyes filled with a profound and desperate remorse. "He's the one who told me what to say. He coached me on how to blame you, how to describe the equipment failure." He pushed the recorder across the table. "I'll testify." The hearing room in the Rayburn House office building was designed to inspire awe and intimidation. It was a cathedral of power, with soaring, coffered ceilings, dark wood paneling that had absorbed a century of secrets, and the weight of a nation's history in its very air. At the center of it all, my father, General Sterling Vance, was giving the performance of his life, and I was his designated villain. He stood at the podium under the bright television lights, his uniform a brilliant constellation of medals and ribbons earned over a 30-year career. His voice resonated with the kind of gravitas that commanded respect, a perfect blend of authority and feigned regret. He spoke eloquently about duty, order, and the grave threat posed by undisciplined elements within the military's rigid structure. With masterful skill, he painted a portrait of me not as a hero, but as a dangerously unstable subordinate, a liability whose reckless actions had jeopardized a multi-billion-dollar, top-secret weapons program. He was a master actor, and the senators on the Armed Services Committee, men who had known and respected him for years, listened with rapt, somber attention. They were buying every word. I sat next to Major Reed at the witness table, my hands resting calmly in my lap. A strange sense of detachment washed over me, as if I were a pilot observing a complex dogfight from 30,000 feet. I was watching the enemy's opening moves, seeing his strategy unfold, but I was confident in the weapons I had yet to deploy. I knew this was his final, glorious monologue. Let him have his stage. The curtain was about to fall. When he finished his testimony, a heavy, respectful silence filled the room. The chairman of the committee, a stern senator from Texas, looked at Reed. "Major, you may call your first witness." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Reed said, rising with a poise that defied the room's oppressive atmosphere. "The defense does not call Sergeant Trent at this time. Instead, we call Airman First Class Marcus Thorne to the stand." A nervous young man in a pristine dress uniform made his way to the witness chair. It was the kid from the diner, the one who had risked his career to do the right thing. His voice trembled at first as he was sworn in, but Reed guided him with calm, precise questions. He presented the committee with copies of the emails and maintenance reports, his voice growing stronger and clearer as he read his own words from months prior, urgent warnings about the F-16's faulty oxygen system. He detailed, with damning specificity, how his superiors had told him to stand down, that there was no room in the budget for a fleet-wide fix. He was painting a picture not of an accident, but of an inevitability. The air in the room shifted. This was no longer about one rogue mechanic. It was about a systemic failure that had nearly cost a pilot his life. The faces of several high-ranking Air Force officials sitting in the front row began to tighten. I glanced at my father. He remained perfectly composed, a statue of military dignity, but I saw his hand, resting on the table, clench into a tight, white-knuckled fist. The first crack in the foundation had appeared. "Thank you, Airman. You are dismissed," Reed said. "The defense calls its next witness, Captain Jonathan Slane." A ripple of murmurs went through the chamber. The press corps, sensing the story was about to turn, leaned forward, their cameras refocusing. Slane, the senator's son, walked to the stand. He looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame that seemed to stoop his shoulders. He took the oath, and without much prompting from Reed, he told them everything. The truth about his reckless maneuver over the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian radar lock, the ensuing panic, and the lie he had been coached to tell. The prosecution lawyer leaped to his feet, shouting objections. "Objection! This is hearsay. Uncorroborated testimony concerning a classified incident from 5 years ago." "I have corroboration, Mr. Chairman," Reed said calmly, her voice cutting through the noise. She held up the small silver digital voice recorder. "This is a recording of a private conversation between then-Lieutenant Slane and General Vance, which took place in the General's office at the Pentagon, one day after the incident in the Gulf." The room fell dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Reed placed the recorder in front of the microphone and pressed play. My father's voice, cold, arrogant, and utterly unmistakable, filled the chamber. An electronic ghost come back to haunt him. "Forget what happened," the voice on the recording commanded. "What matters is what the report says. You had an equipment malfunction on her jet. She's a good pilot, but she's just a pilot. We are playing a much bigger game here, son. Now, let's go over your statement one more time." Every eye, every camera lens in the room swiveled to face my father. His mask of stoic composure finally shattered. A flicker of pure, naked panic flashed in his eyes before he could replace it with a mask of outrage. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it. The legend had been revealed as a fraud. "Finally," Reed said into the profound silence, "the defense calls Sergeant Floss Trent." I walked to the podium. I didn't look at the senators, at the cameras, or even at Reed. My gaze was fixed on my father. The rage that had sustained me for so long was gone. All I felt was a vast, empty pity for this small man who had built a hollow legacy. "Mr. Chairman, Senators," I began, my voice clear and steady. "My story is not unique. I wish it were. But it is a symptom of a culture where the image of integrity is more important than integrity itself, where truths are buried to protect pristine legacies that were never real to begin with." I continued. "The question before this committee today is not whether I broke the rules when I saved Lieutenant Revis's life. I did. The real question is, what kind of Air Force do we want? A force where an airman will risk everything to save a fallen comrade, on the ground or in the sky? Or a force where a general will sacrifice his own daughter to save his career? I let my gaze rest on my father, my voice softening not with weakness, but with a final, devastating clarity. I flew into a storm to save one man. You created a storm to destroy one person. The game was over. Checkmate. The aftermath of the hearing was a media firestorm. The name General Sterling Vance, once a synonym for integrity and heroism, became a symbol of disgrace. News channels ran his decorated portrait alongside damning quotes from the hearing transcript. The Pentagon, in a swift and brutal act of self-preservation, moved to contain the damage. They announced that General Vance had voluntarily requested early retirement, a polite, bureaucratic phrase for being utterly and publicly disgraced. The legacy he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect had evaporated in a single afternoon, a monument of lies collapsing under the weight of a single truth. I watched the news reports from a quiet hotel room in D.C. I saw his face plastered across the screen, the empire he had built crumbling around him. But I didn't feel the sharp, satisfying thrill of victory I had expected. There was no joy, no sense of triumph. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness. The war that had defined my entire adult life was finally over. The enemy had been defeated. And I was left standing alone in the silence of the battlefield, wondering what came next. A few days later, before I was scheduled to return to Nellis, I received a visitor. It was Mason Hawk Croft. He looked tired, older than he had just a week ago, the stress of his choice having etched new lines onto his face. He stood before me, holding a single sheet of paper. It was his letter of resignation. "I made the wrong choice, Floss," he said, his voice heavy with a shame that was genuine and painful to witness. "I chose my son's career over my own honor. Over you. I don't deserve to wear this uniform anymore, and I certainly don't deserve to have been your instructor." He held the letter out to me. I looked at this man, a good man who had been put in an impossible position by a monster. I saw the torment in his eyes, and I knew that was a punishment far greater than any I could wish on him. I didn't take the letter. "Mistakes don't define us, Colonel," I said softly. "How we fix them does." I pushed his hand and the letter gently back toward him. "The Air Force still needs good men like you, maybe more now than ever. Stay. And make sure no other Phoenix has to die in silence." He looked at me, his eyes brimming with a gratitude that needed no words. He nodded, turned, and left. The second visitor was not a surprise. A text message from an unknown number. But I knew who it was from. A simple request. "Meet me at the Air Force Memorial." One last time. I went. The memorial stands on a hill in Arlington, its 3 gleaming steel spires soaring into the sky, mimicking the flight path of a squadron executing a perfect bomb-burst maneuver. It was a place of honor, of reverence, a strange choice for a final, broken meeting. He was standing at the edge of the overlook, staring out at the Pentagon across the river. He wasn't wearing his uniform. In a simple civilian polo shirt and slacks, he looked smaller, older. Just a man, not a general, not a monster. "They took everything from me," he said without turning around, his voice bitter. "Are you satisfied now?" I stood there for a long time, watching the spires glitter in the afternoon sun. I thought of the little girl who had desperately wanted his love, the young pilot who had wanted his respect, the broken mechanic who had wanted to be left alone. "I never wanted to take anything from you," I said finally, my voice calm and even. "I only ever wanted back what you took from me. My name, my truth, my sky." He turned then, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than anger or disappointment or cold authority in his eyes. I saw desperation. I saw a man looking at the ruins of his life, with no one to blame but himself. "I'm sorry, Florence," he said, the words clumsy and weak, a lifetime too late. That single, pathetic word still managed to land like a punch in my gut. A part of me, The little girl who still lived somewhere inside wanted to run to him, to accept that broken apology and pretend that it could somehow fix everything. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. An apology couldn't stitch together the wounds he had spent a lifetime inflicting. "I accept your apology," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was aching. "And I forgive you." He looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. I had to extinguish it. "Not because you deserve it," I continued, "but because I deserve peace. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean we get to pretend this never happened. Between you and me, Dad, it's over." I let the word Dad hang in the air for a moment, a final farewell to a relationship that never was. "My name is Floss Trent," I said, reclaiming the identity I now chose for myself. "I'm not Florence Vance anymore. I hope you have a good life." I turned and walked away, and I did not look back. I left Sterling Vance alone on that hill, a fallen king surveying his shattered kingdom. And as I walked out into the sunlight, leaving the shadow of my father behind me for the last time, I felt the immense, crushing weight I had been carrying my entire life simply lift. For the first time, I was truly, completely free. Freedom, I discovered, is not a sudden explosion. It's a slow sunrise. For 6 months after the hearing, I watched that sunrise spread across the institution I had once loved and then hated, and was now learning to trust again. The fallout from my father's disgrace was immense. It forced the Pentagon to look in the mirror, and they did not like what they saw. A sweeping series of reforms was initiated, aimed at transparency and accountability. A new culture was being forged in the fire I had started. As part of that reform, the Air Force made an unprecedented decision. My service record was not only fully restored, but was unsealed. Becoming a case study at the War College, I was promoted. And then came the order that took my breath away. I was being given command of the United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program. Top Gun. They were sending me back to NAS Fallon, Nevada, the very place where my glory was born and where my tragedy began. My legacy would no longer be a ghost story whispered in secret. It would be a living, breathing torch to guide the next generation. My first day, I stood before them, the top 1% of our nation's combat pilots. They were young, brilliant, and hungry, with the same arrogant confidence I once had. They sat in the tiered classroom, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of awe and intense curiosity. They knew my story. All of it. I walked to the front of the lecture hall, but I didn't stand behind the podium. I stood in front of it, one of them. I didn't start with aerodynamics or missile engagement envelopes. I simply rolled up the sleeve of my flight suit and pointed to the small faded tattoo on my wrist. TG0717. "This patch, this symbol," I began, my voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room, "doesn't just represent skill. Any one of you can fly a perfect sortie. This represents responsibility. It's the responsibility to fly, not just with your hands, but with your heart. It's the responsibility to never ever leave a comrade behind, whether they're falling from the sky or being buried on the ground by a lie." I let my gaze travel across their faces, seeing the understanding dawn in their eyes. "And most importantly," I continued, "it is the responsibility to speak the truth, especially when it's hard, especially when the system tells you to be silent, and especially when your own voice is trembling." That evening, I wasn't in the commander's stately on-base housing. I was on the back porch of a small rented house in Fallon, a simple place with a view of the desert hills, and I was with my family. Jax Calloway, now a brigadier general, was manning a charcoal grill, expertly flipping thick ribeye steaks. Evelyn Reed, who had flown in from D.C., was laughing as she argued with him about the proper way to season meat. And Cody Echo Rivas, fully recovered and now an instructor pilot himself, was passing around cold bottles of beer. There were no ranks here, no salutes, no sirs or ma'ams. Just the sizzle of the grill, the clinking of bottles, and the easy, comfortable laughter of people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side. We ate the steaks right off paper plates, the taste of smoke and friendship a welcome balm. This was not the cold, silent steak dinner of my past. It was warm, real, and nourishing in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rivas looked up from his plate and gazed at the first stars beginning to appear. "Thank you, Floss," he said quietly, using my name, the one that felt like home. "You know, you didn't just save my life that day. You saved all of us." And looking around at the faces of my chosen family, I knew he was right. The final piece of my own healing came the next morning. I stood on the flight line in the crisp, cool desert air, dressed in a flight suit that felt like a second skin. In front of me was an F-18 Super Hornet, its lines sharp and powerful against the rising sun. I wasn't climbing into the secret darkness of the F-23 anymore, flying alone on a desperate mission. Today I was flying with a young pilot, a student, in the seat behind me. My job was no longer just to fly, but to teach, to pass the torch. Before climbing the ladder into the cockpit, I paused. I looked up at the vast, impossibly blue Nevada sky, a sky that had once been my cathedral and then my cage. The desert wind, cool and smelling of sage, blew through my hair, and a smile spread across my face, not a smirk, not a grin of triumph, but a slow, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated peace. The sky was no longer a place of painful memories. It was no longer a battlefield. It had returned to what it had always been meant to be, a promise of limitless freedom. My father had tried to build a legacy out of stone and steel and secrets. He had failed. My legacy wasn't revenge. It wasn't a file in a cabinet or a name on a plaque. My legacy was the sky itself, and I had finally won it back. My fight for the sky is over, but I know I couldn't have faced it alone. Knowing you were out there, listening from your cities all over the world, that gave me strength when I needed it most. Thank you. My story is just one. This channel is a home for stories like ours, stories of resilience, of finding your voice when the world demands your silence. If you want to be part of this squadron, this family built on shared strength, make sure you follow or subscribe so you never miss the next mission. Until then, remember to claim your own sky. You've earned it.